Thank you for joining us today. Please continue to tell us in the chat where you are in the world today. We love to know where our partners are situated, and those who the session was open well beyond our partners. And so if you're new to Spring Point as well, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your work. Our intention is to use the chat throughout as well, as we have an opportunity to listen to our speakers today. My name is Uva Kos. I am Spring Point's Chief Learning Officer, and I'm really thrilled that you have joined us today. If you are new to the series, just as an introduction, we host periodic touch points. They're called our learning series, and they are focused on topics that have surfaced as areas of need for our partner network. So our goal is really simple. We try to have these more conversational opportunities to highlight models we can engage with and learn from, while recognizing, quite frankly, that although we might feature some incredible people, and that is certainly the case today, we also know there is added community wisdom that lives with all of you. So we're hoping that you can not only ask questions, but also share your perspective along the way. Speaking of community, that very word is our focus area for the series this year. Last year, if you joined us at all, you probably remember that we talked a lot about governance and leadership and their intersection. We know that's fundamentally important in the work that many of you do, and we will continue that work this year. But we're also looking at community, a word that I believe holds varied meanings, but is critically important to our work and to the work that many of you do. Today's session in particular is in response to community members in our network who raised a hand and asked for access to tools or to new or amplified ways of thinking about fundraising. So whether you are new to to fundraising or you are thinking about retooling your approach, we're hoping this session will affirm what you have been doing or maybe introduce you to new ways of thinking and doing this work. I'll pause there and just have a few reminders about housekeeping. Today we are a little bit compressed. We are together for about an hour. It will go by quite quickly. So please, throughout, ask your questions. Make sure you integrate them in the chat, and our speakers will try to include them in their conversation, lifting them by reading them, or maybe asking you to unmute and share your perspective more directly if you're comfortable doing so. Following this conversation, we will end, of course, with Spring Point reminders. So 1 hour compressed. I've already taken almost 5 minutes of your time, so I'm going to try my best to get out of the way and just set the table for what I believe will be an important and helpful conversation. Our speaker today is Aaron Walker, who is a Spring Point partner. His bio will be in the chat if it isn't already. But of greater importance, Aaron is the founder and CEO of Camelback Ventures, which is a company that catalyzes social ventures led by underrepresented entrepreneurs, particularly people of color. Aaron's perspective on investing and partnering with entrepreneurs is also informed by his time as a former classroom teacher. I think many of you can relate to that, and by being a practicing attorney. He has been on both sides of the fundraising table and has a robust perspective we can all learn from. Joining Aaron is my colleague, Margot Kane, Chief Investment Officer here at Spring Point Partners. Margot leads our work in deploying investment as a tool across her portfolio. She brings deep experience and expertise in investment strategies, and she tends to be a go-to person in the field. Many of you may be in partnership or in conversations with Margot as well. I think that together, Aaron and Margot have a tendency to think deeply about impact first and to bring that lens to the work they do on a daily basis. And I know they'll bring it to this conversation. So with that, I am moving out of the way and asking Aaron and Margot to join and begin their conversation. Margot and Aaron.
Thank you so much, Uva. Thanks to all of you for being in conversation with us today. And especially thanks to Aaron. I'm really excited to share your experience in this conversation with our broader community.
The pleasure to be here.
In our Zoom room. So as Uva noted, this conversation, we invited you to this conversation in response to what we've been hearing from our partners. And this is not unique in terms of folks that are, operating in the for-profit sector and raising investment capital, folks who are operating in the nonprofit sector, raising grant or other forms of capital. I think that there's a general feeling of concern, worry, experience of greater challenges in today's fundraising environment. We also want to note, many of the conversations we've had with all of you reflect what we've seen as a systemic trend of many donors and investors that have retracted the most rapidly from their pledges to support organizations and businesses led by Black, Indigenous, women, and other marginalized individuals and communities. And this retreat has been visible across all sectors, whether it's foundation grant making, corporate initiatives, or venture capital allocations. So, us as individuals, especially those who are seeking funds, not in a position to fix this trend ourselves presently, but hopefully in conversation with each other, we can at the very least share some lessons learned, some best practices, maybe just feel some solidarity and some encouragement as we're all kind of operating in this environment. And Aaron has been an accomplished fundraiser in multiple sectors and through multiple market cycles, even while he is also grappling with these market dynamics. So we'll get started.
There we go. Let's do it.
So Aaron, will you walk us through some of your most formative experiences and roles with regards to fundraising, and note kind of what did you learn in each role that helped you in the next?
Yeah. I guess my first role in fundraising, outside of the stuff you do as a kid, was being the partner to someone whose job was being a fundraiser. So
the support staff.
Right. So my wife had a job at a national nonprofit where her job was to open up new sites across the country for the organization, which also meant doing a bunch of fundraising. And so I had a passenger side seat to watching her raise $40 million over 2.5 years, without having the pressure of doing it myself, but to sort of watch someone get those at bats and sort of learn through their experience. And in many ways was sort of my first professional experience, even though I wasn't necessarily the one doing the thing. Then my first sort of where I had a fundraising role was I had a job at a venture philanthropy in New York City, focused on education. And so, and it was a nice scaffold up. It was first you get to watch someone do it. And then I had this job where this was in the years where Mike Bloomberg was mayor, and Joe Klein was the school chancellor. So in New York was a place where everybody wanted to sort of put money into this thing that they were doing around education in New York City. And so it was nice because people were coming to us, but I also sort of got to watch what that process looks like, so on and so forth. And then when I left that job and started to become an entrepreneur, and it was all on me. Did one startup where I had to try to figure that out. Did a second where I had to figure that out, and then a third called Camelback Ventures, and then a fourth that I think about, which is a fund we're working on. That have all kind of built my experience from watching someone do it to sort of doing it in a space where I work for folks who had a name brand, and it was a little bit easier to then doing it completely on your own when you are you're trying to do a startup.
And just thinking through kind of the number of operations where you've been in the leadership role and having to fundraise and build your own brand around that, have they all been successful?
No, I often sort of say that Camelback's the third thing I've started. So, it hasn't been all straight line with a positive slope. When my first startup, I left this job at this venture philanthropy and thought like, hey, I have all these connections. I'll be able to just call them as me. And, they took my calls before, they'll take them again. But then you sort of realize that actually you're sort of sitting within a structure that gives you certain privilege and power to be able to like have those conversations. And then when it's just you, not that people were mean, but the response and enthusiasm definitely wasn't the same. And so you have to kind of sort of figure that out, like, people like, hey, take this job and then you'll bring these contexts and it'll translate. And I think that can be true. And it's certainly, I think, more true for, some people. But, as you were sort of saying earlier, I think the degree of difficulty is always harder for marginalized and minoritized populations. And I think I found that to be true in my first two startups. And, I don't think Camelback would exist without those two things. It didn't feel great at the time to go through that. You sort of have to like take your lumps and learn along the way. But I guess what I've also come to learn is that some of this game is about attrition. It's about staying power. And so, I'm still standing.
Yeah, we have a adage that gets thrown around a lot in our investment committee that it takes $40 million of someone else's money to make someone a venture capitalist, which is a giant price tag, but also kind of gets into this question of, well, who's allowed to fail, right? Because I think one of the things that we see in fundraising is it's a lot more misses than hits, right? And you only get better over time, but only if you're allowed those misses, which is part of the challenging dynamic for folks as they get into roles that require fundraising, which is most leadership across any sector. What are some of the kind of core learnings or principles now that you're, with all of these decades of fundraising from all of these different sources behind you? Like, what do you hold dear in any conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think some lessons learned for me. One is just like learn to connect the dots. I mean, you think it's the person, like you probably have this thought in your mind of who is going to give you the money. And sometimes you're right, but sometimes you're not. And so it's always just how in every conversation can you get another one or two or three names from that person. When I think about Camelback Ventures and the first $1 million that we raised, or even the first 250, it came, when I sort of connect the dots, it came from someone that I knew connecting me to someone I knew, that then when I met with them, they connected me to someone that they knew. And then that sort of was the thing that sort of got the chain rolling. And so that I think that's always sort of my mentality, is just like, how do I continue to connect the dots is one. Two is, and you were asking me so about my fundraising journey. This is one of the things I learned by watching my wife, which is like always follow up. Like, and sometimes you feel like following up can make you look desperate or make you look a little bit thirsty, but oftentimes it's just kind of like, it's sort of a cliche, but the early bird gets the worm. So just be if you say you're going to do something, do it, and do it in pretty short order. I've definitely come across folks who have sort of told me that, hey, they sort of put the ball in the other person's court because most people don't follow up.
Yeah.
And so it's like a nice,
it's like a quiet no, right? Like quiet quitting. It's a quiet no. If you don't follow up, then I'm off the hook for having to say yes or no.
Like a nice way to say no without actually having to say no. And they're just relying on you to not follow up.
Yep.
And like half the time they're right. And it's just like, great. And some of them, I get that strategy, why you would do that. And so, you could just keep yourself in the game by just doing that one simple thing. Now, is it guaranteed? No, but I think following up just keeps you in the game. It doesn't sort of make you look desperate, but it just makes you look ready. And so how I think about it.
Although I feel like there are some like great ways to follow up, where you follow up in light of the relationship with that person too, right? Like you say, look, I said I was going to go do this, and look, I went and did this. Or actually, I learned that I needed to do this instead, and so I did it, and this is why. And so it's a continuation of the conversation. Versus there's some ways of following up that I think erode that relationship, like following up with colleagues on like another part of the organization about the same conversation, right? Like that happens where people are like, well, if I didn't make any headway in this conversation with this person, I'm going to try like 3 other people in the same org, but we all talk to each other. And that can be kind of a challenging mistake.
Yeah, I think you use a great word there, which is it's a conversation, right? And so the idea that you're going to go from like one conversation to decision is an anomaly.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it as a conversation, it's like, well, we had a conversation, you shared some stuff, I shared some stuff. Let me keep that conversation going. How can I, continue to teach you about what I'm doing, learn about what you care about? I mean, you know, and like you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like I've been using the same sort of opening couple sentences for like 9 years, and for the most part, it works, right? Like you don't need to think about making this like overly complicated. Like, hey, so and so said I should reach out to you. I hope that's okay. Most people aren't going to say no, but
Yeah.
at least you're just respecting the space. So and so said I can reach out. I hope that's okay. I want to talk about X, learn more about what you're doing, and share more about what I'm doing. Here's some stuff on me. Can we find some time?
Yeah. Yeah. And those weak links on your first point, connect the dots, which is a term used a lot in kind of organizational behavior stuff. The value of weak links, I think in recruitment, where your wife's also an expert, gosh, you married well, Erin. Everyone says like the best talent recruitment strategies, emphasize those weak links. That's where you're going to get your next leader or rock star or what have you. And that's really interesting to apply to a fundraising context. You may start with your nearest and dearest, like our friends and family rounds conversations when you're starting an enterprise. But for the survival of your enterprise or organization, you have to cultivate weak links.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
There's a question in the chat. Can you clarify what a weak link is? It's like a friend of a friend of a friend. It's like a third cousin. So that's a weak link. They're not kind of directly, personally connected to you or your organization.
Yep. Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So this part of the conversation just sort of make me think about also like when and how to make the ask. And I think, one of the lessons that I've learned over time is, sometimes you think that the relationship has to be super deep and you have to know them for a long time to be able to make the ask. And you think like, well, the passage of time and sort of having this banter back and forth, and then, I don't know, 6, 12, 18, 24 months later, then I'll make the ask. And there are times where that might be true, but I think one of the things that I've learned over time is that the way that you deepen relationships with people is to do things with them. And so that doesn't mean you need to ask them on the very first conversation, can I have money? Or, will you go out with me? Like, but I don't think you need to wait forever.
Until you're married.
Right. Right. The process of doing something together actually will deepen the relationship. And then it may not start at like the number that you want or exactly the thing that you're looking for, but you have to start somewhere. And so it's like, do you need to build a foundation of like understanding and trust? Absolutely. Does that need to take 2 years before you're like, okay, now I can ask this person for money? No.
Right. What are some of the other kind of core lessons learned that you apply to your fundraising tactics?
Yeah. One, just like understanding the other person's motivations. I mean, I know that sort of sounds obvious, but sometimes you're practicing what you want to say. You have your pitch down. You're trying to get through all these points. You're using language that makes sense to you. And then you're talking to someone else who isn't thinking about the thing you're thinking about every day, who maybe or maybe doesn't know the language that you're using or the sort of terminology, who has their own sort of menagerie of considerations that they're trying to take into play. And so how can you understand sort of what that person's motivations are, how you need to sort of say and frame things for them so that they can pick up the conversation. And that can be tricky because sometimes you feel like, oh, I'm being someone I don't want to be, or I'm using words that I don't want to use, or if this person doesn't like these words or they can't understand it, that's their problem. And that might be true, but it's also yours now too.
Yeah.
And so, I think the example I always use with this, and this is like a nonprofit example, is we had a Camelback fellow several years ago who was doing work, working with trying to get more Black men to become teachers. And they were pitching a large national foundation on this idea that was funds education. And I was like, well, we get teachers in the classrooms, you fund education. This should be like a quick, simple match. And, we sort of discovered over time that like this private foundation really cared about building like markets of school choice, essentially. So, well, what does a market look like? A market looks like supply and demand. You have demand on the school side, whether that be charter schools or others, and then you have demand, which is like parents want to send their kids to these schools, and that's how you build this market. And so it's like, well, can we think about how they're thinking about investing in education to make a pitch for what you're doing? So yes, it's important to have more Black men in the classroom. Yes, there's a bunch of research that sort of says that it's not only important and edifying for Black children, but quite frankly, all children. All those things are true, and we can share that information with them. But the argument that ended up winning the day was sort of saying, hey, you have this strategy around choice. We're not trying to build, we're not trying to help you with the supply problem, but we can help you with the demand problem, because why would parents want to send their kids to these schools if the teachers look like they're young people? And what we're doing is we're building a program to get more Black men into the classroom. And most of these schools are in communities of color, if not Black communities. And so, we can solve that problem. That became the winning argument, right?
Yeah, you walked into their supply demand kind of framework or worldview.
Right. And so, and it can be hard to figure out that information because people don't always talk about it. Institutions don't always sort of talk about what their strategies are. So it can be hard. So sometimes all you have is just, well, the thing that you're doing, and you're just like pitching them so hard on this thing. But the person on the other side of the table from you, usually a program officer, is sitting there thinking to themselves, I might agree with everything that Aaron's saying on this issue, but I have to go to someone who I work for and convince them that this is the thing that meets the thing that we're trying to achieve.
Right.
And, in some level, what I've come to understand, at least at an institutional level, is that part of my job is to make the argument for the person who needs to go make the argument to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's not only motivation, right? It's understanding the structures in which they're operating. And that is really challenging because they're intentionally opaque, and their theories of change are not often published on their website, and so on and so forth. But the better you understand the constraints that your point of contact is working with, like the far greater your chances of success. Everything from timing, right? Like there are funders that if you aren't in active conversations with them in January, February, or March, they won't fund you that year at all because of their timing situation. If you don't understand that heading into the conversation, right, you're at a disadvantage, especially when you're like, well, we need this money by June. And they're going to be like, that's not how we work. So should we even have this conversation? Who do they need to pitch it to, and how? Like, how do they, this is that whole like, oh, we're trying to determine fit. Fit is, can I translate whatever it is you're doing into language my colleagues understand and see as part of our strategy? And you're one of 100 conversations I'm having. So we're all like attention span challenged on this front, which is a real downside, I think, to your point. Like you could be like totally on board with the argument and the charisma and the kind of strength of the person who's trying to fundraise and the impact their organization has achieved. But if you can't then re-articulate that effectively, right, that investment opportunity or grant opportunity probably won't happen. So arming them with that ability, to the extent that you can, is really important.
Absolutely.
What else What are your other top things?
Sometimes no means no, but sometimes it means not now. And I think so that maybe this goes to the point that you were sort of just making, which is people are looking for ways to say no because they have to give you more, they have to give more no's and yeses. So if you make it easy for them, then you sort of help them out, and sometimes it might be worth it, right? It's just like it's not a fit. You can see it's clearly not a values aligned, and there are times when you just need to sort of cut bait relatively quickly. But also just understand that it's like a long game, that some of it's about timing, as you said. Some of it is about just building someone's understanding and just kind of waiting for that, and that right moment will emerge for itself. And so, there are funders that we have at Camelback that, definitely said no. And it was just like, you know what, that's fine. I'm going to just like put you on the mailing list. You're going to slowly like learn what we're doing. And something's going to happen from that, and that's definitely happened over time. And there's definitely been situations where it hasn't. So I'm not saying that's like a foolproof strategy, but and oftentimes I think that people will sort of, whether they know it or not, they'll give you a little hint as to what needs to be true for it to be a yes.
Yeah.
It just sort of takes a moment of just like being calm with yourself and like listening to what they're saying. And it's not going to always hit you over the head. Sometimes it'll happen, but sometimes it'll just be like this little crack of a statement that sort of lets you know, like, oh, it might be timing, it might be this, it might be a leadership thing, it might be because they're going through a strategy refresh, it might be, that might give you like a little bit of a clue in terms of how to talk about it that might be more aligned.
I think your point about listening is actually such an essential tactic. We don't ask people to pitch on the investment, like a standard, right? A standard thing in investments is people come in, you're like, all right, you got 20 minutes, pitch us. We don't do that. And part of that is because we want to see if the person instigates a conversation with us and can kind of hear where we're coming from too. Some people just lean right into that and pitch at us the whole time. So it's just them talking, which to your point, like, don't make it easy to say no. that can make it easy to say no, because you like, unless you're magically totally aligned with us, which is unlikely because we're a special snowflake, as are all, right, like philanthropic funders. And I'm not saying this like justify that, right, but it just is a fact of these organizations have to justify their existence by being special snowflakes to some extent. If you don't know what our unique pixelation is, like, you can't tailor appropriately, and it shows that you're not really listening, like, and maybe don't view us as a real partner either. So making sure you're like making time to listen is, and listening for, because we're all in this impact space together. Like, what is the impact you're trying to achieve? And if you don't know what the other person's trying to achieve, right, you can't see those intersections that may be there, but may not have been part of your original pitch to that funder or investor.
So yeah, and even I think like even after you get a grant and it's sort of, it's in the bag per se, like, how are you having a conversation around what the other person is hoping to get out of it? So for like one example, we had this corporate partner that's a relatively new corporate partner to Camelback, and we're having a conversation with the person who oversees these partnerships. And I just asked him, I said, are there any internal metrics that you all are, trying to hit, based on this partnership? Are there any communication goals or awareness or visibility goals that you have around doing this? Because, well, I think it's great that they like our work. I understand that corporate philanthropy is not doing it purely out of the goodness of their heart, right? Like they want some level of visibility or some engagement with employees or some storytelling. And so just trying to ask those questions as opposed to just being like, well, here's what we're going to give you, and and here's what the story is. And it's like, well, what are you all hoping? And it doesn't mean we have to do every single thing, but if we can have a conversation around that, then we can sort of see what we can do together.
Yeah. So I do want to note in the chat, David, thank you for recommending a CRM tool, which is customer relations tool. I think probably all of you have been fundraising for a while, utilize a CRM tool. There's lots of free and lots of very expensive versions out there. But I think one of the great things about CRMs, if you use it consistently, is tracking that exact conversation. Because when you're fundraising, you're gonna have hundreds of conversations and you're not gonna remember them. Right? And nor probably are the people that you're having the conversation with, right? So like going back through a CRM tool and being like, what are my call notes from this? What is it that they cared about again? How did they say this one concept that I think of it in a different way, right? And like preparing in that way, like getting into the headspace, a CRM tool is very like one of those kind of aids to help you be on top of your game. And we do not endorse anyone in particular, but they're pretty critical.
There's a lot of them. I mean,
yeah.
We use Notion for whatever it's worth at Camelback.
Now that you're also investing in folks that are trying to get their enterprises off the ground, so very early stage founders who are, experiencing this current environment too, which is more than usually hostile to them. What are you seeing that you didn't necessarily see, like when you were out there fundraising, or when you are out there fundraising every day? Like, what tend to be the blind spots that come up a lot for you?
You're saying like the ones that I have, you mean?
Like when you're sitting in the seat, no, the ones that the entrepreneurs have. Like when you're sitting in the seat of like, all right, I have to make a decision about whether I want to continue this conversation and invest in this company and this founder. Where has your learning curve kind of accelerated on that front?
Yeah. I think one is I think I just start to, I don't know, my heart starts to beat a little bit faster when it's clear to me that the person, they don't necessarily have every single answer about what the solution or product should be, but they have like a really strong insight that's backed up by data of various types, qualitative and quantitative, on sort of like what the issue is, what the problem is, what the market is. I think that makes me want to continue the conversation a little bit more. I mean, I've invested in really early stage entrepreneurs, so the solution I sort of care about, like, but I also know it's going to change. But what makes me nervous, or it's hard for me to get my arms around, is just when someone is just kind of like, and this will be good for everybody. And I'm like, okay. And the part of it is that you know more than I do. Part of what I'm hoping for and like looking for is, can you teach me something that I don't know? And you probably know because you're thinking about this every day. I might know something about it, but if I'm not thinking about it deeply every day, a lot of the details are either non-existent in my head or very hazy. And so, you're part of what your job is educating me, right? And so, like, if you're doing a job on educating me, then I'm just going to have a hard time understanding what you're talking about and kind of mentally walking through where you're taking me. And that can be hard and be less sort of appealing to keep continuing the conversation. And then also, it's like some of it's about numbers, but I think some of it's also about the story. Can you just sort of help me understand, if this thing were to exist, like what would be different? Because sometimes if I can't understand that, then I'm just sort of like, well, then why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And the answer could be to make a boatload of money. Okay.
In venture, that's an acceptable answer, but
which is
not anywhere else.
Which is a fair response. But even those cheesy like Apple commercials or like Google Pixel commercials where they're like kind of showing you like what happens when you use your phone and how the experience you can have with your family and stuff like that. I mean, they're sort of cheesy in many ways, but like they're telling a story about what could be different, not how the semiconductors work in the phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like part of I think my own sort of mental calculation is like, will humans actually do this? Will it have value to people in the real world who are trying to like connect with their families, make money, do the everyday things that they need to do in their life, because some ideas can be very esoteric.
Yeah. I kind of want to double click on this education point, which I find true. This is one of those transferable elements. I mean, having been both, in the fundraising seat as well as in the allocation seats, investors and donors are often generalists, even within our sectors, right? Like we kind of have to be. And that education part, learning from people who are doing the work every day with communities, with customers, with, right, like the environments in which they're trying to have an impact, that learning and that kind of tangible connection to insight and real life, real time events is what gets us most excited. To your point, and it's when you have so many of these conversations per week, per day, I feel like that's something that comes across really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's, maybe there's something there that that could be borrowed as a best practice, right? Like realize that like you're an expert in whatever, and you don't have to have all the answers. To your point, like the design of the intervention or the product or their service, like that's actually not, we know that might change. We're going to have to trust you and your team to be the experts in that, because we don't know. We're not talking to the people you're working with every day, right? But the way we get to that trust is learning from you and kind of seeing the world the way that you see it, and that storytelling. It's incredibly powerful. And sometimes we have folks that, they focus on the intervention or the product or the service to like excruciating detail. And while I really respect their attention to that detail, I think that can do them a disservice in fundraising, at least in early conversations, because you're missing that whole point on like, where does this sit in the broader ecosystem? Are people going to do it or use it or, engage with it? And what kind of unique insights are you kind of bringing to the table? So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I've always like a little one of the standard slide, a slide often in decks is the slide that has like your company, 2 or 3 other companies, and then some features, and then like the
check marks. Like I don't care.
I've been there myself, so, right? This is not to throw shade at anyone, but it's one of those things on the receiving end now. I'm kind of like, I guess this one little feature, because you get to put a checkbox there, makes the thing better. Maybe I don't know. And there may be times where like, a feature really is the difference maker, but oftentimes it's not.
Right. And oftentimes it's the team. And like, we're not, I think one of the things that, at least on the kind of venture capital side, that the perspective we get afforded as investors is this 1,000 flowers blooming concept. Like, yes, eventually there'll be winners in a given sector, but that's so far down the lane and so kind of unrelated to the venture experience that it's not really what we have to figure out. What we have to figure out is this a team we want to work with, we think has like advantaged market positioning so that they can have the impact that they're trying to have? The answer to that is yes. Like, yeah, there could be 4 competitors out there with like variations on a theme, and that's fine, right? There's no like one single perfect answer for all of the questions that we're kind of collectively trying to answer.
Cool.
So we've talked a lot about, things we've learned, fundraising and tactics and strategies and things to keep in mind. But and I think we've only kind of slightly indirectly talked about what, folks who have that power of financial and other resources should be doing better. And you've, in the past, you've been known for being outspoken in your criticisms of philanthropy in particular, but in general, in these power dynamics that fundamentally reside in the fundraising conversations. In this current kind of market dynamic that we're seeing and experiencing, what would your asks be of that, donor investor audience? Like, what should we be getting better at? There's so many options, but top 3.
Okay.
And as you say that, I also am curious for the audience too, what was your experience when you did publicly call out some of the a particularly egregious but by no means isolated example of kind of philanthropic privilege and power abuse?
Yeah. So many things. I mean, one is, so at Camelback Ventures, a couple years ago, we started this program called the Capital Collaborative. And the Capital Collaborative is for white identifying philanthropists and investors, and particularly impact investors. And part of the reason we did that was when we were looking at the data from our cohort of fellows, which are 95% people of color, 60+% women or non-binary, we saw that they were in many ways outperforming their white and or male peers, but they were getting outraced 3-1.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, well, the problem is not them. I mean, of course, not every single thing is going to work, but in the aggregate, they're not the problem.
No.
And in fact, we have this 5-year data set that's sort of saying they're doing the work, but not necessarily getting the commensurate amount of investment. And right, concerning for many reasons. One, we want these particular entrepreneurs to be successful, and if you don't have capital, then you're sort of always, running with one leg tied behind your back. 2, there's like sort of like an existential, sort of worry that eventually enough of these things won't work, and then the argument will be, hey, it wasn't worth doing. And say, I told you it wasn't going to work.
Right.
And then 3, it's just like a problem writ large, right? Like we saw, Echoing Green and Rich Brand put out a report a couple years ago. New Profit and Next Street put out one a few years before that. And so we started this thing. And one of the things that we have learned in it, and sort of getting to your direct question on things to do differently, is folks would come in and then we would be like, can you just show us your data? Like, do you have any data on sort of your portfolio? And they'd be like, no. And I'm like, well, so you ask all of this data from other folks, but then on the most basic question of who you're funding, what are the demographics of those people and those entities, you have nothing. So I think that the most base level, just begin to track some information. Who are you talking to? What are the demographics and geographies where those people are?
Mm-hmm.
Who are you investing in? Are you do you have numbers behind what percentage of your portfolio is going to certain populations? You sort of can't fix a problem that you don't know exists. And if you don't know it exists, that could be purposeful or not. I'll leave that to that person to decide. So I think that's one basic thing, is just begin to track the data so that you can really understand what you're doing, sort of what your habits are leading you towards. So I think that's one. I think two is just understanding that like money is not the star; it's just a piece of the puzzle, right? Like uh, uh, someone I know pretty well, we always talk about this idea of hyper agency,
Hmm.
like in philanthropy and in investing. And I think particularly in philanthropy, this idea that like the person who has the money and their agents know best, and like
Mm.
and sort of using their money as a means for control as opposed to collaboration, right? So how can you see your money not as a means to control an organization or a person or a situation, but as a means to be in relationship and to collaborate with a set of people, entrepreneurs, communities, and you can add your part, which is like the financial resource part. And I mean, I think in some ways we should use the word like alternative public investment, because then it changes it from being your money to actually being the public's money. But that's a whole other conversation.
Having the golden share idea, and never doing restricted grants again.
Yeah, I mean, um, general operating grants.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I think they're easy, is an easy first step to sort of say like we don't solve big problems just by funding a project. That people in communities don't experience one problem at a time, right? They experience a multitude of problems at a time. And so how can you sort of how can you think about your philanthropy as a more holistically and sort of in a trust-based way to say, hey, like I'm going to give you this money. Let's align on what the outcomes need to be and what we're trying to achieve together. But how you get there and how you use the money, like we should give you the same flexibility that we would give a for-profit entrepreneur who's raising VC, who doesn't have to say like, well, I use this 2% on overhead and, you know,
Yeah.
sort of all this sort of inane tracking that you have to do around dollars, and just being
Yeah.
able to free people to actually do the work if you trust that they can do it.
Yeah. The trust component.
Yeah.
There's a lot of conversation about trust-based philanthropy and trust-based investing. And I think there's a lot more conversation than action on that front, because we're not trained to function that way, and the organizations aren't structured to encourage that. And it takes kind of a very intentional series of actions over a period of time, really, to start doing that well. And yeah, I'd be curious. I don't know if folks' experiences in like raising from trust-based, self-identified trust-based philanthropists is any better than their experiences fundraising from those who don't associate with that movement, which is kind of an open question. But before we get to that, Erin, I'm curious. I mean, a lot of times, we think about the privilege of being able to be critical of philanthropy and investors. You've been critical openly. Were you concerned that would impact your fundraising? Did it have the opposite effects? Like, did it supercharge it? Like, what were your thoughts when that, when you engaged in that conversation in a public forum?
Yes. I'm assuming you're talking about the open letter to
Yeah.
the grant that I wrote a few years ago. I think so. What motivated me to write the letter, beyond just kind of being in like deep frustration at that particular moment, was, it was sort of on the heels of all the stuff that was happening in 2020. And I think part of what I thought to myself was, if folks can be in the street putting their body on the line, then the least that I could do is write this thing, um, you know, and send it in, and they can put it on the internet and and see what happens, and just sort of be to at least tell my version of the truth. So I think there was part of me that sort of said, hey, like there are these moments and opportunities where like you have an opportunity to speak up and to say something, and the momentum is moving in your favor. And so people are doing their parts in places where they feel like they have influence, and so I have an opportunity to do the same. And so I just decided to go for it, and I think the interesting thing was, there were definitely people who I engaged with afterwards, who thought I was talking about them. Um, and I guess my response was, if it speaks to you, then listen.
Right. Right. You may
Um,
have penned it in a moment of individual experience, but it's definitely not an individual occasion. And I'm going to put it in the chat for folks so that they know what we're. Oh, thank you, Uva. You beat me to it.
And has it impacted fundraising? I don't know. I mean, I think at that time, there was probably less pushback that I might have gotten if I wrote it today. So I suppose sometimes, when we talk about timing, right, it's sort of like, I guess, look, it's, as Dr. King said, it's like it's always the right time to fight for justice. But right, there are definitely times where you're like, things are moving more in your favor, and so you can sort of push a little bit harder in those moments. I don't think so. Like we raised the most money we ever raised in 2020, 2021.
Yeah.
So at least for that period of time, I don't think it did. Maybe it'll come back to us in the next couple of years. But again, I think there's been a movement towards regression anyway. I'm not sure if my letter, was going to make it any worse for us.
Yeah. So I want to make sure the hour went really quickly. I'm also posting the Capital Collaborative offerings from Camelback in the chat for folks to refer some of their donors or prospective donors to. We've heard great things from participants in this. I've participated in at least one of the sessions. It's been, I would say it's been pretty successful. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, we're making progress day by day. Like the data that we have right now is that there's been a little over $20 million that have been reallocated based on the participants that have gone through the program to, marginalized and minoritized entrepreneurs. That's like a drop in the bucket in the big scheme of all the money that is in philanthropy, let alone sort of in, private markets, but you have to start somewhere. And so to me, I feel like we're at the very beginning, but I'm encouraged. I think we have, sort of influencer type organizations that are moving through, whether it be like MacArthur Foundation or Blue Meridian. And so, if we can be able to get the institutions that folks are looking to often for how to behave, start to change their behavior, then I don't think we need to have everyone go through the program to be able to make the impact that we want to make.
Yeah. Yeah, the big organizations, the big money take a lot of time to change. One of the strange dynamics we've seen in this current market is a lot of the entities in the investment space that came out in 2020 after George Floyd's murder with a commitment around, funding for racial equity and the racial wealth gap in particular, dispersed a bunch of money and then kind of like exited the market this year. Problem solved. But those who did not come out immediately, some of them had started an internal journey to put in place more permanent programs that are just now hitting the market, which has been interesting to see that difference in timing, in the nature of the funding and the program. And I'm thinking predominantly of the big banks right now, right? So some of them like immediately just like sprayed out a bunch of money. So like, that's great, thank you, right? And then a bunch of the others were kind of made a public statement and then were not active at all, but have now moved a lot more money actually into these sleeves that are really focusing on marginalized and otherwise underrepresented communities that are more institutionally sound versus a one-time program.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, it took us decades, if not centuries, to get here. And Well, I would like to think that the solution would happen in, a half decade. It probably won't. And so, the ability for people to build like the foundational muscle to be able to do this and sort of change who they are as institutions. Like we sort of built a certain system that created a certain set of things. And so we can build a different one. We have to choose to do that and be able to put in the time to be able to make that happen. And also, it's sort of talking about the letter. Like what are the sort of right moments for advocacy at this moment, as well, to sort of not let folks off the hook who said that they were going to put, invest $200 million and have only put 10%, on the street, or, some of what I'm seeing now are, philanthropies who, the first sort of non-renewals are some of their Black and other people of color-led organizations, that are coming at the last minute without warning and without a closeout grant. And philanthropy is like a weird space, but there are norms to it. And when those norms are not followed, particularly for a certain set of folks, it does sort of make you wonder, how far it'll continue to go.
We're at time. So thank you, Aaron, for having this conversation with me, with our partners at large, and the SpringPoint team. And folks can send us questions. As we said, ongoing conversation. But hopefully this was helpful, or at least encouraging. And Uva, back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Margot, and thank you, Aaron, for sharing your wisdom. We recognize this could have probably taken us a day, right? If not more, to really delve into how you have approached this work, lessons learned that are transferable to those on this call. So thank you for taking the time. We know you have a lot going on to begin with, as does everyone who's here today. So thanks all of you as well for taking some time to hopefully learn or maybe reflect on a few things that might help in your work. We see a lot in the chat and appreciate that as well. And Margot, thank you as well for framing our conversation as only you can. For those of you who we're getting ready to roll off in just a minute. So if you're still here, beyond our gratitude for spending time with us, I do want to remind you and underscore what Margot said. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, this is obviously a large topic and we wanted to just at least scratch the surface. But if you have very specific questions or ideas around a session that could help you think about this work in an even larger way, in a deeper way, let us know and we'll certainly think through that with you and figure out how we can create some supports that can help you in the work you are trying to do or already doing. And if you have wisdom of your own that you want to share, we'd love to kind of highlight your work as well so that we can all learn from you as well. Final reminder, look out for some session updates and invitations that are coming your way for events in May and June. Again, most of that rooted in community. And so if that is work you care about and you want to convene with others who do, let us know and look out for those invitations. With that, I want to thank all of you. My email is in the chat. If you don't have it directly, certainly reach out to me directly if you want to continue the conversation or start a new one. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you soon.